Hello and welcome to Adepicos Online. We're looking at Module 5, Plot of the overall learning journey of how to lead, and we're looking at Step 3, Creating a positive culture. Creating a positive culture is one of the greatest challenges in leadership. The reason why it's so important to do this is that the culture of an organization or in a team defines the way that things get done. In other words, if you want to consistently deliver great results, then you need to have a great culture in place that enables the people to deliver great results. And that's where we need to look at how we generate culture. Because culture is not generated by talking about inspiring values or printing out value statements and vision statements and, putting them up on walls or websites. Those are all great touches and those are all important steps, but those on their own are not enough to generate a positive culture. Culture is actually generated by the way people act and the way that they behave. So actions are individual steps that people take. And we can think of behaviors as the patterns of actions that people and even teams and entire organizations take. So to build a positive culture, you need to enable your people to focus on taking positive actions that result in positive patterns of behavior that result in the end in the emergence of a positive culture. And we can think about this by comparing two different teams. Team A has the values of looking after people, planet, and profit. Those are their values and their priorities. Team B have exactly the same set of values, people, planet, and profit. However, the leaders of Team A decide that of those three values, really, we're just here for the money, so let's just actually focus on maximizing profit, and the other stuff can sort of come later as an afterthought. Whereas in Team B, the leaders make sure that the organization remains true to all three values. So what's going to happen over time? Well, let's think about how the people in Team A are going to act. They're going to start taking actions that seek to maximize profit. And they're going to do that at the cost of people and the cost of planet. What that means in practical terms is that they're going to act in ways in which they'll take decisions that will have a negative impact on the environment, and they'll act in ways which will often have a negative impact on people because their real value is to maximize profit. And that's going to result in certain patterns of behavior. It might be that they start acting unethically. It might be that they start cutting quality in order to make sure that they build less expensive products and can sell them for more money. And overall, what will happen over time is that the prioritization of profit over the other two values will result in a culture in which people are only seeking to maximize profit. And as we will see later on in this module, that can lead to devastating consequences. On the other hand, the leaders of Team B, by making sure that all three values are lived, will result in a very different culture. The people will be acting in such a way as to make money, but also looking to consider their environmental impact and the impact that their work makes on their people around them. As a consequence, it's likely that they're going to behave in a very different manner. Of course, it's still important to make sure that you're making money, but they're also going to behave in a way that will typically be more ethical, and at the same time, it will also be behaving in a way that they are more aware of their environmental impact. Now we come to a crucial point of understanding here, because those two seem to be in complete contrast. On the one hand, it's about maximizing profit, and on the other hand, it seems to be this sort of idea of let's just be a bit soft and do the other stuff. And what I want to be able to explain to you in this module is that that other stuff, that softness and those values, is actually the magic source that drives long-term success. So as always, a great way of understanding the concept that we're discussing is to apply it to the world of football. And it's clear that culture plays a crucial role in the success of all football teams. Great football teams build very positive cultures that enable the best out of their players. They encourage players to perform at their maximum and also guide them as to how they should behave. If you go and play in the best football teams, then you'll be expected to behave in such a way in which you're training hard, that you're respectful to your other players, and that you are always engaged and pushing yourself to be as excellent as possible. That's the culture that exists at the very best teams around the world, regardless of which soccer sport that we're talking about. On the other hand, we can recognize that it's also about the way in which the game is played. So, for example, the culture of soccer is going to be very different to the culture of the NFL, or indeed of Australian rules football. Even though all these three sports are somewhat similar in the sense that they're all about a ball and two teams chasing after the ball to try and put points on one another, these three different sports have very different cultures, and it doesn't simply happen because the balls are different shapes and colors and sizes. It's because of the way in which the game is played. It's about the way in which the teams interact with one another and the way in which the fans interact with one another. For example, in the UK, there's a big contrast between the cultures of soccer and a sport called rugby. So in soccer games, the fans are typically separated and segregated. They aren't allowed to mix, and they're certainly not allowed to drink any beer or other forms of alcohol when they're in the stadium. On the other hand, if you go to a rugby game, the fans freely mix and mingle with one another, and they're often having a laugh together, sharing a beer, and also often challenging each other about which team is actually better. So what that goes to show is that different sports can have incredibly different cultures, and that also can be applied in the context of leadership, because you could be leading two different teams, but the result is that they are creating two very different cultures, and we need to understand why those different cultures emerge if we are to be creating effective and positive cultures in our teams. So what is culture? Culture is a set of shared mental assumptions that guide interpretation and action in organizations by defining appropriate behavior for those situations. In other words, what culture is about a team coming together and saying, this is what we think reality is about. This is what we think is important. This is what we think is good. This is what we think is bad and should not be done. But then what's important to recognize is that the way in which those shared assumptions are created is in the way that the people and the organization behave. It's not simply putting up values on a wall to say, this is the way that we need to behave, because we know enough situations where people say that they believe in one set of values and actually behave in a very different kind of way. So putting up, high and mighty ideals is not the way in which you build a positive culture. A positive culture can only be built by the way in which those people behave. A useful way, I think, to think of culture is to think of it as the living personality of the collective. As individuals, we all have our own personalities, our own sense of identity. And that's not really something that happens in a team or organization, because obviously it's a lot more complex than that. We can't really think of a team as having its own personality per se. Instead, we can think of it in terms of culture. So what makes a team unique is the culture that emerges out of the way in which it behaves, in the same way that a personality makes an individual unique. Now, what's also important to recognize here is that your personality is not defined by one particular aspect. If you think about the kind of person you are and your sense of identity, it's a result of many complex things interacting with one another. Maybe your belief systems are important, the local situation in which you grew up in, the culture that you are currently living in. All these things come together to create the unique individual who you are. And in the same way, we can't really think of culture in a team or an organization as being a simple concept. It emerges out of many complex things interacting with one another. So what I'm trying to emphasize with that point is that we have to be very careful around this idea of exerting direct control over culture. Because a leader can't do that in a specific sense of saying, right, I want a culture that acts with integrity, and then suddenly, boom, magically that's going to happen because the great leader has commanded that. That's never going to happen. Instead, the leader can control and influence culture by influencing the way that the people behave in that culture. And so by ensuring that people have positive behaviors, it makes it... So I keep talking about this idea of positive culture. So to enable you to better understand it, we're going to look at the complete opposite of what happens when you find a rotten culture. And that's why we need to look at the banking sector. Bloomberg described in July 2012 that banking has what he called a rotten culture. And the reason why it described that was something called the LIBOR scandal. So LIBOR stands for London Interbank Offered Rate. And what it basically is an interest rate that describes how much people and how much organizations should pay for their loans. Now, I'm not going to go into too much details about it, but essentially what happened is the banks manipulated this interest rate to make people pay more interest than they should have done on their loans. So what was the consequence of this? Because it's easy to be hard-nosed about it and say, it's a bit sad. People had to pay more money than they should, but okay, whatever, right? Well, if you're the leader of these banks, it turns out that you've been landed with record fines. So Barclays was fined $450 million US. The United Bank of Switzerland was fined $1.4 billion US. The Royal Bank of Scotland was fined $585 million US. But the winner, in a sort of twisted sense, was HSBC Bank, which was fined $1.9 billion US, which is in fact greater than the entire GDP of Bhutan. Now, that's quite interesting because if we look at HSBC's values, and if you type in HSBC values into Google, you'll find this quote from its chief executive, Stuart Gulliver. By setting the highest standards of behavior, our aim is that all of our employees and customers can be proud of our business. Well, it turns out I am a customer of HSBC, and I'm not particularly proud of my bank being fined $1.9 billion US in order to pay for its dodgy dealings. Unfortunately, that was not the end of its worries, because in fact, not only was it fined $1.9 billion for the libel scandal, HSBC was also fined $881 million for laundering money for 2 drug cartels in Mexico and Colombia, and for accepting $15 billion worth of unexplained bulk cash deposits in countries such as Mexico, Russia, and other countries. The US Department of Justice detailed how HSBC allowed drug traffickers to launder billions of dollars in the United States and billions more to be moved across borders to countries facing UN sanctions such as Burma, Cuba, and Libya. In fact, the trail of ethical destruction was so great that the Department of Justice considered banning the HSBC from ever doing banking in the United States again. Now, why do we care about this as leaders? Why is this so important? Well, we need to look at why did the bank behave in this kind of way. We can't pass this off on individuals. We can't say that there was a rogue trader here or a rogue team there. This happened because their culture exists in these banks that allows that kind of behavior to happen. It is deemed acceptable to allow libel manipulation to take place. It is deemed acceptable to allow trading and dealings with drug dealers and drug cartels. It is deemed acceptable to try and find a way around UN sanctions. And the reason it's deemed to be acceptable is because in the end it is about the money. And that's what the values of these organizations actually are. Whereas they talk about being dependable, they talk about doing the right thing, that's also listed in HSBC's values. What they actually end up doing is chasing after the money. And rather than setting the highest standards for their customers and their employees, they end up being fined billions of US dollars for unethical behavior. Now, the reason why this matters from a leadership perspective is that the culture that you allow to emerge in your team or organization will define the way in which that team and organization behaves. And the leaders at these banks allowed this kind of culture to exist. It is impossible for them to argue that they were leading this bank or they were leading the individual teams, and yet they had no idea that this kind of culture took place. I'm not saying that they individually knew about everything that happened, because that's unlikely, but what I am saying is that when you're the CEO of an organization, or when you're the leader of a team, you know what the culture of your team is, and you know what's going on. And these people were smart enough to recognize what the real culture was in their organization. And the fact that they didn't do anything about it and allowed that negative culture to exist is what has resulted in these organizations being landed with the record fines that they have. And so I hope that shows a really practical sense of why culture is so important, because it really affects the reality of your organization and the things that it will and will not do. So in summary, the reason why culture is so important for an organization is that it defines the way in which that organization is going to behave. Is it going to behave in an ethical manner or an unethical manner? And that's why Booz & Company, one of the world's top consultancies, described culture as being more important for business success than strategy or leadership. And that's why I've included it in our learning modules here. Because if you want to build a successful organization, then you must build a positive culture to empower that organization to do the right thing. And that's why if we look at General Electric, one of the largest and most successful companies in history, the first line of their annual report is this: culture is the foundation for any successful enterprise, and ours inspires our people to improve every day. It's why GE works. So think about it. General Electric, one of the world's most successful companies, start their annual report with that sentence. They don't talk about strategy, they don't talk about their new products, they don't talk about financial performance. The first thing that they tell their shareholders and the world is how important their culture is, and that their culture is essential for the success of their organization. In contrast, we can look again at where culture has gone wrong. And we have here an examination of General Motors, which was once the largest car company in the world. So GM's core problem is its corporate and workplace culture, the essential attitudes, mindsets, and relationships that are passed down year after year. So GM has struggled for many years to turn around the company and become the success that they once were. And what David Brooks is saying here is that the problem with the organization is not the fact that the way it makes money or the products it designs. It's much deeper than that. It's the actual culture that exists in the organization and the attitudes that emerge out of that culture that limit and inhibit the way that the organization behaves. And so, in summary, what I really want you to understand is that if you are going to build an effective organization, you must find a way to build a positive culture. And that's what we're going to look at next. So how do you go about building a positive culture? The first step to understand is that culture is created through repetition. Aristotle said that we are what we repeatedly do, and that applies to organizations as much as it applies to individuals. What he meant by that is that the patterns of behavior that exist in your life determine the way that you live your life. And so in exactly the same way, the patterns of behavior in an organization or in a team determine the culture that emerges in that team or organization. So the way that you can influence the patterns of behavior is through the 6 R's that you see in front of you. You can't just go around telling people, do this, do that, don't do that. That's a bit too command and control. And what you're likely to do is create a lot of ill will towards you as people resent being overly controlled in that manner. So you need to be more subtle in how you influence people. The first level is recognition. Who are you recognizing on a daily task of saying, hey, that's a good job, nice one, or no, that needs to be improved in some way? Recognizing people is a very simple yet powerful way of influencing them, because the people that you recognize are going to be in turn the people that accumulate social respect, which is step 2. So we can imagine at a bank, for example, the people who are making lots of money are going to be recognized by the bank, and as a result of being recognized, they're going to be increasingly respected within the bank and within the bank's teams. Now, the question here is, they're obviously not being respected and recognized for their high sense of integrity and ethics. They're being respected for making the most amount of money without really any understanding of how they actually went about making that money. And so that's where we can start to see that these subtle influences play a key role in influencing how these individuals behave. Because as you start to respect people, you reward them for making the right behavior. And continuing the banking example, that would manifest itself, for example, in the way of having a bonus. So what you've done is you've recognized, for example, Joe Bloggs as doing a good job of making lots of money. And by giving him that recognition, he gets a lot more respect in the team. And people aspire to be like him because, oh, look, Joe's the best because he's making the most amount of money. And we can see that he should be respected because he's also getting a great reward, which is a big fat bonus for making all that money for the bank. Notice how there's never any conversation here around the ethics of how he's actually gone about doing it. What is important to recognize is that one step leads to another, and that the people that you start to recognize are the people that start to get respect, are the people who start to accumulate rewards. What happens next is remembrance, is we start to tell stories about what happened. So we'll say, for example, oh, do you remember when Joe Bloggs last year, he did such a great deal, and as a result, he made the profit of the bank increase by 20%. Now, that might seem like a very small step. All we're doing is really remembering what he did. Well, yes, but you're starting to build a story around him. You're starting to say, this is something that was great because we're repeating what he did. And so that act of remembrance plays a crucial role in influencing how people should behave. And that takes us to the final step of rituals. And the rituals in an organization are the ways in which you repeatedly do basic tasks that are unique to the organization. So the rituals might be, for example, running a Monday morning meeting. It might also be the way that you celebrate the success of a deal going through. Every organization has unique rituals that define which it is. But you need to be conscious about having the right rituals in place. So, for example, continuing the Joe Bloggs, the narrative here that we have, let's imagine that the ritual around Joe Bloggs is that, we've given him the recognition of making lots of money for the bank. We've given him respect and bonuses, reward, and we talk about him in a really powerful way that make him seem like a role model for the bank. Well, what we then get is the ritual of people then emulating behavior of Joe Bloggs. And so everyone else wants to have this ritual of going through the performance review to get that great bonus. What we don't see is, for example, the ritual around ethical behavior. How are you making sure that you have built ethical behavior into the decision-making structure and the rituals of the bank? Well, the honest answer is that they haven't, and that's why the bank had the fines that it did. And so in the same way, you need to think about these 6 R's in your team. Who are you giving recognition to? Who are you respecting? Who are you rewarding, and in what way are you rewarding those people? What are the stories that are circulating around the organization? And finally, what are the rituals that embed and emphasize the organizational values? As a leader, you can influence all of these R's. And that's why you need to think about repetition, recognition, respect, reward, remembering, and rituals as crucial tools for influencing culture. And we can see some examples in front of us. So in the top left, we have a picture of something called Winterbourne Care Home, which was a care home in the UK for mentally disabled patients. Now, the tragedy of this place is that a secret investigation by the BBC revealed that, in fact, there was a culture of abuse that existed at the care home, and some really horrific footage emerged of people who were meant to be looking after these mentally ill patients actively abusing them on a day-to-day basis. The reason that's relevant to us here in our conversation around culture is that the leadership of this care home enabled a toxic culture to emerge of abuse. The mentally ill patients were abused on a day-to-day basis, and we can see how the R's start to play in here. The repetition of the abuse is what made it normal for the people at this care home, and it's only when outsiders came in that they were shocked at what they found. On the other hand, we have an organization like Google. Now, Google are well renowned for building a positive culture in their organization, and let's look at the simple actions that they do in order to make that happen. They invest a lot in providing the best food for their people. It's estimated they spend over $72 million. Now, that might seem like a small step, but what they're doing here is they're demonstrating that they really care about their people. And in that way, by demonstrating that care and acting in that way, they show that they are able to build a positive culture around having the best people. Looking to the darker side again of what kind of cultures can emerge with poor leadership, we have here a picture of Lance Armstrong. So recently it's emerged that Lance Armstrong and his team were creating an endemic culture of cheating, that he won the Tour de France through a culture of drug taking. And when we think about it, that is an incredible letdown not only for the world of cycling, but the world of sport in general. Because here we have one of the most recognized and respected athletes in the world, and it turns out that everything that we thought he had achieved was in fact a lie. And so that's where culture is not just simply about driving performance, but it's also about the way that people feel. Imagine discovering that your personal hero had actually been a liar, and that he was actually taking drugs in order to make sure that he could achieve the victories that he wanted to. How would you feel about that? And finally, we have an image here of Dr. Devi Shetty, who is a heart surgeon in India. And what he's done from a leadership perspective is transform healthcare for millions of impoverished people in India. The Wall Street Journal has called him the Henry Ford of heart surgery, and what he's done is create a culture of innovation in Indian healthcare, which is not only rapidly transforming Indian healthcare, but is actually making it a world leader in being able to deliver high-quality heart operations for a fraction of the price that it costs in the West. So it's a great example of a leader here using culture to drive innovation to solve impossible challenges and in that way enable millions of people to access the life-saving heart surgery that they need in order to live. So I think that's the right example to finish on in terms of Dr. Devi Shetty and the way that his heart surgery is transforming the lives of people, because it reconnects to that original idea that leadership is about building a better world. Remember that we need to have that vision of what the world should be like. 21st century leaders are the people who prepare to stand up and say, this is what I believe a better world should be like, and we're going to work together in order to build that world. And in order to build a positive culture, you must connect the culture to the original resonance of responsibility and vision. You're not going to be able to build a proper culture, a positive culture, if it's not grounded in an authentic sense of responsibility and a passionate sense of purpose. So let's take a moment to summarize why positive culture matters. Culture matters because it defines organizational reality. It's incredibly important for defining what is allowed and what is accepted. Secondly, the more positive the culture, the more positive the behaviors and outcomes will be in the organization. Now, by positive, I don't necessarily mean that it has to be a super happy and fun place. What I do mean is that it has to be a space which allows positive behavior to drive positive results. And that's where you need to use your judgment as a leader in order to make sure that you're driving the right behaviors. So, for example, if you're simply saying make as much money as possible without any regard for the way in which you're doing it, then you can't be surprised that a few years later you're going to be landed with multi-billion-dollar fines for your unethical behaviors, because you encourage the wrong kinds of behavior without really getting people to reflect on the way in which they're generating that money. And then finally, the reason why culture becomes important from a high-performance sense is that a positive culture is the key to providing the energy that an organization needs to unlock sustained high performance. In other words, high-performing organizations are catalyzed to be high-performing by creating a culture of high performance. But how to do that is another question for another day. So as always, I want to leave you with some practical tips on how to build a positive culture. And no, I'm not going to read out the entire PowerPoint slide in front of you. I deliberately filled it with quite a lot of information because I think it's something that you can just pause the recording right now and read it for yourself. But I think it's important to provide you with lots of information around this because I do recognize that it is challenging to build a positive culture. So the more advice that I can supply you with, hopefully the more useful it will be. But I do want to just focus on the four key concepts here. The first is that you have to focus on the people and cause that you serve. And that connects to what I was talking about just a moment ago about making sure the culture is grounded in the sense of responsibility and the vision. It's clear that when we look at the banks, they lost their focus on who they were really serving. They weren't serving their customers. They were serving themselves. This is simply the reality of banking culture today. It's more interested in achieving its own bonuses than it is in making sure that its customers and its shareholders are getting what they deserve. Secondly, once you're clear about the people and the cause that you're serving, make sure that your strategy and your culture are aligned, because these two need to be in harmony. The third step is to make sure that once people are working in a positive manner of doing the right strategies and doing the strategies in the right way, we need to find a way of building a sense of passion and pride for excellence. Now, the reason why this is so important is that you want your people to be continuously improving themselves. It's not just about turning up to work and then going home and nothing's really changed. Real organizations that are interested in real high performance are constantly striving to be as excellent as possible. They're looking to grow their capabilities, challenge themselves with new adventures. And as a result, the way to do that is as a leader to create a culture of passion and pride for excellence. And then finally, there are, I believe, fundamental behaviors that are necessary for ensuring an effective culture. The first is that the organization must be authentic. If you can't remain true to yourself, then you can't be yourself. So this is obviously, in my opinion, necessarily true. If you can't be authentic culture, then you're not going to be anything at all. So the first step is to strive to be authentic. The second is to strive to be open. Closed cultures are the ones that face the greatest damage because they don't have the courage to look at themselves and see how they need to change in order to adapt to the changing world. So instead of being closed, be open. Have the courage to embrace and explore the unknown rather than fearing it. And then finally, transparency. Teams, organizations operate on trust. And the only way that you can build trust in the postmodern age, where levels of trust are at record lows, is to be transparent. You need to be transparent about the way you behave. You need to be transparent about the things that you're doing or not doing. And that requires courage. You need to have the courage to have that transparency in order to engage your stakeholders and build the levels of trust that your organization needs to be successful. Your task as a leader is to make sure that your organization is being authentic, your organization is being open, and that your organization is being transparent. And that's where you need to look into your own heart and find that courage to drive those ideal behaviors forward. So in summary, a great culture is the key to enabling greatness. A practical way of doing that is to use the 6 R's to guide the way you influence the people and the organization. And finally, above all else, it is the leader's responsibility to ensure that the positive culture emerges. Though you can't directly control it, you can use mechanisms such as the 6 R's to strongly influence the way that the organization and the team behave. So the final task is to find a way to integrate plot into the diagram that we've been building of how to lead. So just to quickly remind you, we started with the green star purpose that attracted the right passionate people. We then made sure that there was the right plans in place as represented by the light blue arrow. And then we had to make sure that people were performing the plans, and that's represented by the dark blue arrows. But the challenge that was missing is that there was no overall organizational reality. What is the context in which all of this activity takes place? Because we need to understand that everything always takes place with a certain kind of box. We all live in our own reality bubble. That's what we need in order to exist. We have to have a reality in which we live in. And the organizational reality is defined by the plot that the organization creates. So in essence, all of us, all the stakeholders in the organization are actors upon the stage that the organization creates for itself. And that's what's represented by the purple box. That purple box you can think of as the stage upon which all the actors that are involved with the organization or in the team are performing together. And what I've done on the right is represent that box accumulates year on year. So the reality of year 1 of the team, for example, is a basic platform on which the other realities accumulate. And so what happens over time is that we sort of build these boxes together. So what this means is that these boxes represent the organizational reality. They are the lenses through which we perceive the world around us. What we did last year, what we are doing now, and what we aspire to do in the next year define our organizational reality. And the plot of our organization is that we pursue that reality. We are the actors on the stage of the organization. And so I've represented that in this diagram by adding the deep purple arrow. And the reason why I've added that larger arrow is to represent the overall embeddedness that we have by being involved in the organizational plot. By participating in the organization, by being engaged in the act of sense-making, by being engaged in the master narrative, by being engaged and living in the organizational culture, we participate in the overall plot of the organization. And that determines the way we perceive the organizational reality, and indeed even ourselves. So completing this module leads us to one of the great secrets of leadership, which is that it is the opportunity to define the reality that we live in. The plot that we create to describe the people and the organization moving through time defines the reality that we live in. If you think about it, the plot unites purpose, it unites people, it unites the plans, it unites the performance into one meaningful whole, one meaningful description of what we are doing together over time. And that description defines the reality that we live in and the one that we perceive. And that's why the purple arrow is so large, because it captures everything that we've been talking about so far. And you can also see that the people within the organization, within the purple arrow, they understand the reality in terms of purple. They see a purple world because they live in a purple organization. And the reason they live in that organization is because of the plot that you have created as a leader to define their reality. And so now that's where we touch into the idea of describing reality, because it's important to create a reality in which people positively view themselves and the organization that they live in. People don't want to have a negative understanding of themselves, and people don't want to have a negative understanding of the organization that they live in. Your task as a leader is to build that positive reality of perception, and you do that by creating a great plot. And key elements, as we've covered in this module, for building a great plot are to master the art of sense-making, to build a great master story, and to build a positive culture that enables you to unlock the capabilities of your people. If you can master these three capabilities, then you will have in your arsenal one of the most powerful tools in 21st century leadership. It is challenging, but at the same time, by building an effective plot, you'll be empowering yourself to create and sustain high-performing organizations in a way that few people can.